We finally located one man with the tractor, but since it was harvest time, which is a short time in a long year, this man had already agreed to work elsewhere that day, so things were not looking good. But then he suggested that there might be one fellow, a newcomer to the area, who wouldn't have the crops and stuff yet for himself, and he might be free. Knocking at his house aroused his fierce dog, and Tibetans have just the most fierce dogs in the world. You just don't even want to go near them ever. And our knocking brought his wife to the door. The man was still asleep, but she would wake him. And after some time, out he came, rubbing his eyes, and our guide gave him the pitch. Now, I don't understand Tibetan, only very little. But I could see by the way he was shaking his head, that much I could understand, things were not going the way we had hoped. I signaled to our guide to up the ante until he couldn't afford to refuse, and that tactic worked. He agreed to take us, and our own driver left us standing in the road, waiting for the tractor man to get his machine. His machine was housed in what looked like an outside garage. And when the man opened the garage door, it turned out to be just really an enclosed courtyard with no roof, and that's where the tractor was kept. Then there was the starting of the tractor, and the fact that the cart where we would have to ride was filled with water, which had to be drained out. That done, we all climbed into the cart, sitting on empty feed bags and blankets that his wife brought out just before we were about to get our butts wet. She tucked a small bottle of butter tea and some tsampa under the driver's seat. That was his lunch, and we were soon off, although it seems that we were moving at a snail's pace. The idea was to ride the tractor as far up the mountain as it would go, saving our legs for the really hard part. As it turned out, there really was no road at all where we were going. Instead, we followed a dry stream bed uphill, moving very, very slowly toward the mountains. After a mile or so, it became difficult for the tractor to pull us in the soft mud. We all had to get out and push. And pretty soon we were spending more time pushing than riding. It was clear that we could go no farther. And so we left the driver and the tractor to wait for us, perhaps the whole of the day. I've no photos from the first part of the trip because we were shrouded in mist, and then after a while in clouds. I mean, we're talking about Tibet, and we're talking about mountains. I can tell you that it was tough going even from the start, once we started walking, as in it was all uphill, and it was steep at that. Our first goal was to climb to a small village called Sekhang Zirka, a village that was perched on a ridge. We would call it our base camp, from which we would push off up the mountain to Crystal Cave, which we were told was a hard 3-hour climb from the ridge. But reaching that village was a long haul from the valley, maybe 5 kilometers, and always going up, steeper and steeper. Even though I don't generally use caffeine, I had mental images of arriving at the village and having a nice warm cup of butter tea, knowing that the long climb would burn off any bad side effects the caffeine might have. Anyway, at last we did reach the village, which was more like a bunch of mud houses strung together. There was no tea. Everyone had already abandoned the town for the season, for the winter, and they'd moved back down into the valley. By this time, we were breathing hard. After sitting for quite a while, we moved on. Now, from here on, it really got steep. Something I thought it had already been. And it's hard to describe, but in many cases, we were just scrambling up steep slopes of boulders, big boulders, climbing over them, because the so-called path had become just a wide staircase of strewn rock and boulders. So my so-called, by me earlier that morning, light day pack, the little knapsack I was carrying, soon began to feel heavy indeed, and my wife and I just kind of dropped behind while our daughter and the guide went on ahead. After a while, Margaret and I, the two of us, gave up any pretense of being tough and just began to sit down on the ground when we needed to, which was like all the time. At the worst, we were maybe resting after every 20 or 30 feet. And I mean sitting down, taking off our backpack and just resting. What can I say? I'm getting old for sure. But it was tough. Our guide met a local man who was up there looking for some lost yaks, and he was hoping to drive them back down before the coming winter. He and our guide went on ahead, and our daughter as well, and she quickly passed them by, leaving both of us kind of in the dust. One of the guys took pity and grabbed Margaret's pack to make it easier for her. By this time, we were walking in the clouds, or at least surrounded by them. In time, we climbed above even the mist and the clouds and began to be able to see more of the mountains around us. We were essentially walking up the spine of a great wide ridge on the side of a mountain, with a deep canyon across from us.